Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching these videos, at least I hope you are. These Zoom talks have been organised as part of the events programme for the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust. If you don't know this organisation, the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust is a small charity which raises money to help in the repair of churches of any Christian denomination. Last year, it gave grants of 120,000 to 27 churches and chapels in Yorkshire. We do not charge for these talks, but we'd be very grateful if you consider making a small donation. Details for giving are on the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust website, which is an excellent one. So after the commercial, we can begin. First of all, I must give grateful thanks to David Neve, who supplied many of the images, and particularly the charts, which you will see later. I must make a confession, I'm not actually normally a great fan of most Victorian church buildings. I find the churches that they designed dull and lifeless. But while I'm often critical of the Victorian ruthless rebuilding of medieval churches, for the Sykes churches, I do make an exception. So looking at this slide here, and you can, I'm just moving myself slightly out of the way, you can see three churches. Here, the one on the right-hand side here of Garden on the Wolds church, which has a beautiful interior, which we will see later. Down here is the church of Sledmere, completely rebuilding of a church in 1893, though it looks very much like a medieval church. This is the church next to the family home of the Sykes family, and there is their house. The church had been originally in the centre of the village, but as was the wont of 18th century landowners, the villagers were often moved, so they weren't seen from the big house. And so the village is now further down the road. And then the third church is Bishop Wilton. And I've shown it partly because it has it is an old church, but it was rebuilt, and it has a very fine interior. And just point out some of the features, the painted ceiling, the iron screen, and a very fine reredos, which you can't really see very clearly, but you will see details later. Now, if you don't actually know where these churches are, this is there are two maps here. Here is Driffield, Bridlington, and Scarborough. There is the family home of Sledmere. There is a church called Kirby Grindelithe that we will be looking at, East Heslerton up here, and Helperthorpe and Weaverthorpe. And this other map shows Malton and Driffield. So again, you know more or less where you are. There is the family home at Sledmere, and a few of the other churches, the most westerly one of Bishop Wilton, Thixondale, Garden on the Wolds. So these are some of the churches which we'll be looking at. So we'll now, and here is the house at Sledmere. Looks an 18th century house, but appearances are often deceptive because the original house was almost completely destroyed by fire in 1911, and it was rebuilt, but virtually on the same footprint and plan of the original house. It was built between 1913 and 1917. So it is basically an Edwardian house, but looking very much as it was in the 18th century. And as the fire was a slow one, they were able to rescue most of the contents. There are some changes inside internally, but externally it does look like an 18th century, late 18th century house. And here is the first of the two baronets, Sir Tatton Sykes, the fourth baronet. He was a great character. He's shown on horseback. He was renowned for his stamina, the fact that he could ride long distances without showing any signs of fatigue. He was a great landowner. The family owned over 38,000 acres of land in the Yorkshire wolds. They were extremely wealthy. They had an income in the 1850s of about 52,000 a year, mainly from rents, partly also from horse breeding, but they were mainly landowners and farmers. He wasn't particularly interested in church building as far as we know, but he did, as so many of the landowners in the middle of the 19th century did, he did restore or rebuild some churches on his estate. And this is one that he did fairly early on, and this is at Wetwang, where he restored or paid for the restoration of the chancel. As I expect you know, the patron of the living was always responsible for the maintenance of the chancel, and sadly, they very frequently didn't spend much money on them, so that the chancels in churches were often the bits that in the worst condition, because the parishioners looked after the nave. So in the 19th century, when there was this great phase of church rebuilding, the local landowners often financed the building or rebuilding of the chancels first. And his wife was very pious, and she did present the church with various things. When Sir Tatton I died, he was so noted in Yorkshire that people subscribed to a subscription to raise a monument to him. He was actually said to be one of the sites of Yorkshire. It was said that there were 3 sites in Yorkshire, York Minster, Fountains Abbey, and Sir Tatton Sykes. So there was generous support for this memorial, and they put up this extraordinary monument to him on Sykes land in the Yorkshire wolds. The building, I always think, looks a bit like a space rocket, but it hasn't taken off yet. You used to be able to go up inside it, but I don't think you can any longer. I'm sure health and safety wouldn't allow it. So we now come to the more extraordinary character really in our story. As I said, most landowners did rebuild or restore some churches on their estate, but only Sir Tatton was rebuilt or newly built 17 churches. And in fact, he was the greatest church builder probably in the country. Well, certainly was without doubt the greatest church builder in the country. We can look at the churches, or not, we won't go through all 17 of them, but I'll just point out some of them. There is the one you've already seen of Sledmere. Up at the top here, I'll just move the picture, there is Garden on the Wolds, and there is Bishop Wilton. And we will actually see a few of the others as we go through them later. So the question is, and here is a picture of Sir Tatton himself. The question is, why did he actually do it? Well, first of all, he never wrote anything about the reason why he did so much. He was a very quiet, very shy man, very unusual, very eccentric in many ways, but extremely interested in architecture and would travel great distances to see churches. When he died in 1913, I mean, he actually was master of the estate for over 50 years. But when he died, in the church at Sledmere, a monument was put up to him, and it mentions, as monuments normally do, his great achievements, that he built 6 churches, that's i.e. 6 completely new churches at Fimber, East Heslington, West Sutton, Dixondale, Elperthorpe and Wansford, and then rebuilt or restored these other churches. It also mentions that, like his father, but rather more successfully than his father, he bred thoroughbred horses, which again helped in the income of the estate. The one perhaps statement that we might just question is the last comment here, that his deep solicitude for his tenants and dependents, which won for him their respectful affection. Well, like many landowners, he was very autocratic, and if tenants did as they were told, that was fine, but otherwise they could well be in trouble. So why actually did he do it? Well, this is a suggestion by George Edmund Street's son, who wrote this afterwards. And I think it's worthwhile reading, because I think it is probably an accurate summary, that he was anxious to give every village a building where people could meet for public worship, a building that should be an incentive to worship and should, by the purity of its architecture and the completeness of its arrangements, insensibly affect for good those who are gathered together within its walls. And certainly, not only did he have these churches built, he didn't stint on making the churches as beautiful as possible, even though, in fact, many of the villagers were staunch Methodists and, in fact, preferred to go to their extremely plain Methodist chapels rather than the beautifully decorated churches. But what he was doing was actually giving villages which previously had had no churches a church, whereas previously in these very small hamlets, villagers would have had to walk 3 or 4 miles to the local church. Now, this timeline is quite a complicated one, but it's well worthwhile looking at because it explains the various stages of church building over the period of, well, 60 years actually, from the 1850s until the death of Sir Tatton in 1913. The first period, it goes into 2 periods really. The first period is what's called the golden age of farming, because this was when profits were high, there were no imports from abroad, and so the rents were good, and the income of landowners was correspondingly high. So this was a period in which Sir Tatton I, the 4th Baronet, was in charge. And as I've mentioned, he did do some church building or restoration, and he actually did have one church completely rebuilt. And the architect whom he employed was John Loughborough Pearson. His wife died in 1861. As I say, she was very pious and very keen on having churches even in the small hamlets. He died in 1863. He was succeeded then by his son, as I said, Tatton II, who was very keen on architecture. And one of the first things that he did was he paid off Pearson and he employed George Edmund Street, who was already becoming a very well-known architect and was perhaps, some people would say, one of the greatest of the Victorian architects. He immediately started on this plan of building churches where there hadn't been any. So Wansford, Dixondale, Fimber, Helperthorpe, you see in black, are all new churches. Weaverthorpe was restored, Kirby Grindelithe was restored, West Lutton was newly built, so that you've all of those done in a very short period of 12 years. Oh, yes, I've forgotten East Heslington. Tatton too was a bachelor, and he remained a bachelor for several years, but at the age of 48, much to everybody's amazement, he married Jessica Cavendish Bentinck, who was 18, completely different in character to him. She was social, liked going out. She wasn't that interested in church building. He was more reclusive. So the marriage was really basically a disaster. But apart from the marriage being a disaster, the next period, there was great stop of church rebuilding. And this was because of the period of agricultural depression, when imports from abroad came in and meant that nobody wanted English corn or beef. It was the cheaper corn coming from America, the beef from South America. And so, not surprisingly, and partly probably because of the marital problems, Tatton Sykes did no church building in this period. Street was paid off, well, no, Street wasn't paid off, but Street ceased to be employed, and Pearson did do some work on the finishing off the churches. But in the 1890s, Tatton too once more began to be involved in restoration of churches, not building any new churches. They'd all been put already in the villages. So these were restoration of churches or extra work to churches. The only new church was the one at Sledmere, where there had been a church, but this time it was a complete rebuilding. And the architect that he used for this was Temple Moore. By 1900, architects and patrons don't always see eye to eye, and so Temple Moore ceased to be employed, and he turned to the fourth architect of Hodgson Fowler. And Hodgson Fowler, the last actually 10 years, did the last restorations, and again Wetwang, some more work there, Fridaythorpe, Langtoft, and Sherburn. He died in 1910, and so the work was finished off by Walter Brierley, who I'm sure many of you in Yorkshire know his name. Just a couple of other points too. Sir Tatton Sykes himself died in 1913. So amazingly, from 1963 for 50 years, much of his time had been spent on church building, and he was continuing to finance the restoration of churches almost before he died. Just a couple of other points just to mention quickly. Though I said there was no church building in this period, he had some plans to build a large church at Sledmere. At one stage, his wife and his young son converted to Catholicism in 1882. And at this stage, the relations between them were not particularly bad. And under her influence, he did consider providing funds to build a Catholic cathedral in London. That would have been Westminster Cathedral. But even he realized that the huge cost of that was too much for one man, and he withdrew from it. So, having gone through the background of the owners, we'll now look at the 4 architects who were employed. First one then, one who was first employed by Tatton I, was J.L. Pearson. He is now particularly known for the building of Truro Cathedral, magnificent building, but that was after he'd ceased to be employed by the Sykes family. He had done some minor work in the East Riding, but he then gained his most reputation in the East Riding by commission to build the church at South Dalton. This was for Lord Hotham, beautiful church, if any of you have visited, and you can see it for miles around because it's got a very fine, very slender spire. Not only is it very striking outside, it also is beautifully decorated inside. And as you can see, at the time, it was a huge sum of money that it cost, 25,000. As I've mentioned, landowners were prepared to make sort of a statement really on their estate by building at least one, perhaps large, beautiful church. But Tatton II certainly did far more than any of the others. Here is another church that was rebuilt. There had been a church at Kirkburn, and as I mentioned, the thing that he did was the restoration of the chancel and made it into, you see, previously it just got a sort of Gothic type doorway. Here you've gone back to Norman windows. And the other 2 churches that he did work on, Garden on the Wolds, again, the chancel. Here you can see also the part of the nave. We'll be looking at this church later because this part was done by Pearson, but later on, Street was going to be providing the magnificent interior. And the other church is Bishop Wilton, again, an old church, but Pearson was very good at sensitive restoration. And this church, which had Norman features and a Norman doorway, which was in a bad state of repair, he restored it very well and very carefully. And again, under Street, the church was going to get a very fine interior. And this is the one new church which Pearson, or at least the Tatton I, had built. And rather a sad story here, because there had been an old church which they pulled down. Pearson designed this church, a rather plain one, but in 1941, it was destroyed by enemy bombing in the Second World War. But after the war, it was rebuilt by another architect very much associated with the East Yorkshire, Francis Johnson. It looks very much Scandinavian, which of course was very a fashionable style of architecture. I think he did incorporate a few features from the previous church there. Now, as I mentioned, almost immediately after Tatton I's death in 1863, Tatton II started on his rebuilding plans. And he paid off Pearson. He didn't like Pearson's plans, and he employed this very much up-and-coming architect, George Edmund Street. Some people regard him as perhaps one of the greatest of the architect of the 19th century. Man, very accomplished, fine draftsman, very interested in Gothic architecture. He'd spent a lot of time traveling abroad, and he wrote 2 books on North Italian Gothic and in Spanish. He's most remembered really for his building of what were the law courts, the Royal Courts of Justice, that we so often see on television. I happened to see something on television, I think last night, with showing features of the building. And in fact, in the entrance hall, there is a statue to him. So he, like all of them, or like Pearson and Street, they were both London-based architects. The other 2 were less so. His first commission, though, in Yorkshire was at Howsham. And some of you listening may well have been on the trip that we did last year where we visited Howsham. It is a very unusual looking building, doesn't look at all like a traditional medieval church, and it does show the influence of his continental travels. So you've got this porch, this narthex, very unusual tower, sort of like a belfry, very much a continental apse here, and there's a very fine quality decoration inside. So this had been finished by 1860, so Tatton too would certainly have known about this church, and this was presumably why he immediately turned to Street to do church building for him. And this was one of the first churches that he was commissioned to do, a completely new church in a small village at Wansford. And here you can see a couple of Street's features, really, things that he particularly introduced into churches, so that you've got the chancel, the stone chancel, which is very, or chancel screen rather, is very much a feature of many of his churches. And here is the vaulted part at the west end. Tatton too's mother had always wanted a church to be put in Wansford, so it may have been the reason why he started there. Another remote village where Street was commissioned to build a church was Dixondale, and this is a photograph of it just after it was finished. Here is it now. You can see it's a very plain church. Many of the churches that Street built in Yorkshire are very plain. They're not particularly architecturally distinguished, but they are all beautifully finished inside. And not only was he commissioned to build the church, but also the schoolhouse and the vicarage. So it makes a whole ensemble there, and the Lich Gate. So the whole lot goes together. Here is another completely new church, photograph taken shortly after it was finished. Again, you notice the unusual tower and the belfry. So that's a present photograph of it. Another new church at Helperthorpe. Again, it is very much the feature, these unusual sort of brooch type steeples that he put in. Many of the churches, when he was building a new church, he tended to put the chancel higher than the nave. In other words, so the eye would go up to the altar, part of the making the service more relevant. He was, in fact, Street was deeply religious. Here he couldn't do it because here at Weaverthorpe, this was an existing church. It was an old one, Norman church, built on a hill overlooking the village, but he restored it and again put in all of the internal fittings, which are again of very high quality. Another church which was restored and virtually rebuilt inside is Kirby Grindelithe. Whole nave was put in completely. All these arches and the chancel arch are all part of almost complete rebuilding. But again, you'll notice the chancel screen, very much a feature of all of his churches. And we will see later on that there's a very unusual feature on the west wall of the church. Another church that, a new church that he built, again, each church is quite different, so that, you know, the very unusual west window, the stone vaulted in the chancel, again, a very fine painted reredos here. And again, the rather unusual tower. Though it wasn't a particularly large church, it cost a great deal of money. You know, by the standards of the day, in the 1860s, it cost over £13,000. It's difficult to really do an accurate estimate. You know, you can either do it on average earnings, cost of living, and so on. And these estimates were put in a long time ago. So basically, he was just spending a lot of money on the churches. And it was probably very nice for the architect when you knew you had a client who didn't query too much about the bills. So later on, he was going to argue on some features of street work. And if you remember the church at Howsham, I think you can see the slight resemblance to it here is at East Heslerton. You notice the stone vaulted chancel, the screen, again, the timbered roof here. The naves tended to have these barrel timbered roofs, but these stone vaulted chancels. Again, the brooch type steeple. And the porch, like a narthex really, again, very similar to Howsham. And again, rather like West Lutton, a very expensive church. I do not have to think I've got the figure of how much it was, but I can't find it. But as I said, when in the 1880s, he, partly because of the agricultural professions or for other reasons, he ceased to employ street, and it was in the 1890s, so sort of a 10-year gap, that Tatton restarted his church building project. And this time he turned to Temple Moore, who had done some minor work for him in the 1880s, but it was in the 1890s that he began to be used as the favoured architect. And first of all, with fairly minor work, redoing a new tower at North Frodingham, also doing the tower at Wetwang, and putting in a completely new aisle at Helperthorpe. Now, we've seen Helperthorpe before. That was a street church. You can see that photograph was obviously taken just after that aisle was put in. But the thing that Temple Moore is most associated with is the complete rebuilding of Sledmere from 1893. As I mentioned, there had been a church, a medieval church at Sledmere, but it was pulled down in the 18th century, and this very sort of plain little box was put instead. The tower was actually kept. And that's what the church looked like inside. You notice just chairs rather than pews. But this is what Templemore came up with. And he was able to build exactly as he wanted, with really no care for the cost. This church is estimated to have cost £60,000, which, if you remember that South Dalton had been admittedly much earlier in the 1850s, that cost 25,000. This is 40 years later, but this was an enormous amount of money to be spent on a complete church makeover, really, well, rebuilding and furnishing. And here is the laying of the foundation stone of Sledmere. And here you've got Templemore holding the plans. And here is Sir Tatton. As you can see, he is an exceptionally tall man, and a plethora of clergy around him. And just to give you some idea of what the Sledmere looks like inside, notice the very fine light fittings. All of the churches have something similar, these brass light fittings of varying degrees of magnificence. Extremely high quality stonework, the carvings of the figures on either side, the sedilia and the piscina, again, beautifully carved. We'll see those in a bit more detail later. And notice again the quality of the pew ends here in the choir stalls. And also the very delicate, very unusual altar rail there. Templemore was also responsible not for the design of the Eleanor Cross, because of course that was a copy of the medieval Eleanor Cross. They used the one at Northampton, which was the best preserved one, but of erecting it and designing its actual structure. This was put up originally as a market cross, just as a cross in the village. But after the First World War, it became a kind of war memorial, and brass plaques were added to young men of the area who had died in the First World War, and including a brass plaque to Tatton II's son, Sir Mark, who had taken over from his father in 1913. He was a diplomat, and he had been at the Treaty of Versailles after the end of the First World War, and he died of Spanish flu. So he is commemorated on this Eleanor Cross as well. By 1900, as I mentioned, the Tatton II ceased to employ Templemore, and he turned now to Charles Hodgson, Hodgson Fowler, sorry. I'll just go back a minute, there we are. He was very much more a northern architect, and all of his work was done in Durham, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and Nottinghamshire. What brought his attention to Tatton II was the rebuild of the design and the building of the great church at Norton of St. Peter's. And this probably brought him to the attention of Tatton. And he was given the work of more restoration at Wetwang. Remember, already Tatton, the fourth Baronet, had actually done work there as well, but Hodgson Fowler did work there. He also did some work at Fridaythorpe, putting in a new north aisle, and completely restored the interior. So you can see what it looked like beforehand. Here you've got the chancel screen, as I mentioned, one of the features, completely new roof there, new windows, that altar rail is taken away, and the old pews have been adapted and altered. So the whole thing looks very much smarter. The plaster, as Victorians tended to do, taken off the walls. And one other feature, you can just actually see it at the end of the tower there, a rather fine church clock of 1903. And these are the last two churches, at Sherborne, the Langtoft up here, and Sherborne, both rebuildings. Sherborne quite massively rebuilding, because the very strange towers taken away and replaced by a much more conventional one. But when Hodgson Fowler died in 1910, as I mentioned, Walter Briley finished off the work. We've mentioned that the churches were all beautifully decorated, and so now look, this is the last part of the talk, on the work of the artists and the craftsmen. Worthwhile just looking, sorry, I've gone on too far, the chart just to show the sequence where they all were trained or came from. These two, Clayton and Bell, had worked in Gilbert Scott's office. They formed a partnership and set up a business making stained glass. And in the middle of the 19th century, it was very profitable because so many churches were being built or rebuilt that there was a great demand for new stained glass, because all of the earlier churches attended, the medieval glass had gone and they tended to be plain glass. So Clayton and Bell were the first ones to really go into very much manufacturing on a really large scale. And later on, two more of their apprentices who'd worked for them again formed their own firm of Burleson and Grills. Another one who'd worked for them, Charles Kemp, did some work, and Victor Milner had worked for Burleson and Grills. So this is this sequence that we'll see. Another person we'll be looking at is Redfern, who was a sculptor. Here is Garden on the Wolds, which I've mentioned several times, but this time to look inside it. Here is some of the stained glass that Clayton and Bell put in, very much in the medieval form. This is actually in Garden on the Wolds. This is a much earlier stained glass window they put in at Bishop Wilton. But this is the thing that is most remembered in Garden on the Wolds, this whole sequence of wall paintings, and the whole church is covered with these wall paintings. On the west wall, you've got the, traditionally as it often is the Last Judgment. The nave is covered with scenes from the Old Testament, and in the chancel are scenes from the New Testament. But notice also some of the other features. The tiles here are very sensible, so the people's bodies don't press against the paintings. The very beautifully carved front cover, and I think you just notice the tiled floor, and again the pew ends carved here. And this whole scheme of wall painting had cost over £3,000. Here is their bill, Clayton and Bell, glass painters, but this is the bill for wall painting. And more of it, again, as the expulsion from Egypt. And they had another series of scenes from the months of the year. And appropriately, here is January, with him warming his hands beside the fire. And the other points to notice there, the beautifully tiled floor, the metal work on the choir stalls, and the very elaborately carved chancel screen. And here you've got a close-up of this is the creation of the world, painted there at Garton on the Wolds. And I think it's quite interesting to compare how designers use the same motifs. Here they've transferred it into stained glass. And so if you look up, there is the whale there, and here is the whale. So it's been, the picture's been, design has been reversed. It's not exactly the same, but you can see the inspiration. So that's at Garton on the Wolds, and that's in Pixendale. And here are some more of the Clayton and Bell work, the marriage feast of Cana. You can see the incredible attention to detail here, in far more so than you would get probably in most medieval stained glass. And David and Solomon, and at East Heslerton, and St Andrew in Weaverthorpe. But remember, you saw that Burleson and Grills had trained with Clayton and Bell, and they founded their own very successful company. And in fact, they began to be preferred. Their work, in some cases, was of a higher quality than that of Clayton and Bell. And so they began to be used. In some cases, they replaced the work that had been done by Clayton and Bell. And this is an example at Helperthorpe, where their scene of Christ-saving Peter replaced a window that Clayton and Bell had put in. And you can see how carefully they did the leading so that it didn't go over the faces. And rather a nice one that they put in there at Sledmere of Bede in his study. And Victor Milner, again, had worked for Burleson and Grills. Again, I think very fine attention to detail. Look at the paint in the decoration on the halo in the background. The decoration there on the sword. I think the one of St Augustine is particularly fine. That again is at Kirby Grindelwald. One of the other features of many of these churches, and again it was something that Clayton and Bell tended to do, was the ceilings were painted, the roofs were painted. They were stencil paintings, but they did contribute to the richness of the interior. And here you've got at Helperthorpe, the painted nave roof. And here are three other examples, one at Weaverthorpe, Bishop Wilton, and West Lutton. Each design different, all done to remarkable attention to detail. And again, giving an example of this is all very much the work of Street. He designed this chancel screen at Kirkburn, and it was painted by Daniel Bell. So he was the brother of Alfred Bell, a member of Clayton and Bell. And I think you must admire the craftsmanship that there has been put in. All of this, even though labour was cheap, it's certainly going to cost quite a bit of money. And you notice again the tiled floor here and the very nicely carved chancel roof. Remember, I mentioned at Kirby Grindelwald that it had an unusual feature on the west wall, and this was certainly a very unusual feature, and that is of the, not so much the feature that's unusual, the ascension into heaven, but the fact that it's been done by an Italian company in mosaic. They actually commissioned the Venice and Murano Glass and Mosaic Company to put in this mosaic. I think it's the only church I know that's got this enormous mosaic in it. And we've looked already at Sledmere, but just to go over some more of the details of the equipment in Sledmere, the light fittings here, the chancel screen, the lectern, and the altar rails. These are all the work of temple design designers, but this was the work when the Temple Moor was doing the church. And notice the carvings even of the pews. And here is a close-up of the screen. And Temple Moor employed a company, very fine woodworkers, John Thompson and Son of Peterborough. Their firm continued right until just before the Second World War. But the quality of their workmanship is superb. And there is, remember, we've seen the brass lectern before. And more, they did the font cover, the pew ends. They also employed a man called John Baker to do the stonework, and he did the figures on the Eleanor Cross. He did the Piscina and the Sedilia as well. Also, the carvings of the roof bosses, these are all Sledmere, and over the chapel in the North Aisle. I think when you look at all of this, you can see where £60,000 came from. But he wasn't the only stone carver that they used. There was James Redfern, who was commissioned to do work throughout the country. He did the figures on the Albert Memorial, he did figures on Salisbury Cathedral, but two small churches. Here we are at Kirby Grindelide, designed by Street, crucifixion, and a nativity scene, both beautifully done. And of course, you have got the figures of Mary and Gabriel here of the Annunciation. Another feature of the churches were the tiled floors, some of it done by big firm of Minton, East Heslerton and Kirby Grindelide, other one at Weaverthorpe by a firm called Godwin. We've seen the floor there, the tiled floor at Garton. And just to point out that though Sir Tatton was prepared to spend a lot of money on the churches, there were periods when he wasn't all that prompt at paying up. And here's a rather sad letter from a company called Ratty and Kent, who had installed the pews at Garton on the Wolds in 1879, but they were still writing in 1880 to be paid their money. I'm afraid this is, but I assume that they were eventually paid. And we looked at the beginning at Bishop Wilton, and just a couple of points of Bishop Wilton, the painted nave ceiling. Temple Moor designed the font cover and put it in partly, though, to notice the floor, because this is what the floor looks like, this incredible mosaic floor. Again, rather like the mosaic at Kirby Grindelide, this was an Italian mosaic, but installed by an English firm, designed supposedly based on the one in the Vatican. And if you're losing heart, we're nearly at the end here, just to show some of the quality of the metalwork. The screen here at Weaverthorpe, and at Wansford. And even the attention to detail just on the hinges and supports of the doors at Weaverthorpe, and even on just a plain cupboard there, both really very carefully done. And here we come to the end of our description of the churches, because one of the things that Sir Tatton required was that each church that he had financed the building or the rebuilding of should have a plain bust of him put in the church, a small plaster bust with the word, his name, Tatton, there, that's all. I think he's looking with a rather enigmatic expression. And so I think you can try and decide why he spent over the 50 years of the time that he was owner of Sledmere on all of this colossal program of building and rebuilding. And I think rather like the monument to Christopher Wren in St. Paul's, if you seek his monument, look around. Well, here, if you visit the churches, and I hope you will do some of them, you can do it 17 times looking around and think of the person who was behind all of these buildings.